Welcome to the Insight Meditation Community of Charlotte. My name is Ward Simmons. I'm one of 7 Dharma leaders that rotate responsibility for leading. So this evening and for the next 3 evenings, we're going to continue our Sutta summer series. And in this series, each Dharma leader will select a favorite sutta and then share their understanding of it. So before beginning, I'd like to just circle back to a point that Clyde made last week when he was giving his talk, and he gave us an overview of the Pali Canon. So the Pali Canon is the body of literature from which the suttas are drawn. And we, IMC Charlotte, have a concise 2-page summary of how the Pali Canon is organized and the contents, which can be really helpful because it's a fairly arcane way that it's organized. And so this will be posted sometime later this week under the Resources tab on our website. And if you find this series is sparking an interest in suttas for you, I would encourage you to go to that summary and print it out and keep it handy. It'll be a way to help you become more adept at working with the suttas. So I am going to be speaking on the Jata Sutta, also known as the Tangle. And if you choose to look it up, it's Samyutta Nikaya 7.6. And I spoke on this sutta several years ago, but I really like it, and I think it's useful to revisit our understanding. For me, my understanding changes over time. Plus, I really like it. So I hope you do too. So first, I want to read an excerpt from the sutta, but before I do, I want to make 2 points about reading a sutta. First is there are always multiple translations available, and it can be really useful to have more than one translation, because in one, there might be a particular phrase you find in the sutta that is not, it doesn't resonate with you. Well, what is he talking about? What does that mean? And so if you go look at another translation, a different translator will translate that phrase differently, and then you might say, oh, now I understand what he's talking about there. The translation I'm using tonight for the Jata Sutta is by Bhikkhu Bodhi. The second thing I want to make is just kind of a disclaimer. The language that was used during the time of the Buddha was not particularly user-friendly, in my opinion. And in particular, it's not so friendly when it comes to gender. And so the Buddha taught primarily to males. Males were given higher value, and that's reflected in the suttas. So I take the liberty of changing genders and in the sutta when I'm reading them. And I have no doubt that there are some who would object to this practice, but I believe on balance it's the right approach. So I'm just saying that so you'll know that. So in this sutta, the Buddha has been visited by a seeker by the name of Jata, hence the title Jata Sutta. It's the Sutta to Jata. And he poses a question, and the Buddha responds. And it's in 4 stanzas. The first stanza is the question that's been posed, and the last 3 stanzas are the Buddha's response. So I'll read it now. So this is Jata to the Buddha. A tangle inside, a tangle outside. This generation is entangled in a tangle. I ask you this, O Gautama, who can disentangle this tangle? And the Buddha responds, the first of 3 stanzas, a person established on virtue, wise, developing the mind and wisdom, a practitioner ardent and discreet, she can disentangle this tangle. And then the second stanza, the second part of the response, those for whom lust and hatred, along with ignorance, have been expunged, the arhats with taints destroyed, for them the tangle is disentangled. And then the final stanza, where name and form ceases, stops without remainder, and also impingement and the perception of form, it is here this tangle is cut. So let's look carefully at each of these four stanzas. The first is Jata's question, and it seems pretty straightforward. He states that there's a tangle both inside and out. Now, my understanding of that, the inside tangle is what's going on in our minds. I don't know about you, but sometimes I get a tangle in my mind. And then the outside tangle, I understand to be tangles we get in with others, so emotional tangles in people out in the world, with people out in the world. Now, when he uses the phrase, this generation is entangled in a tangle, I don't think that's a unique reference to one generation in history. I mean, really, doesn't every generation think that the younger generation is terribly misguided? Isn't that the way it's always been? So I believe he's really referring to humankind, the human condition. So really, Jata's question in a nutshell is, who can disentangle the inner thoughts and the outer emotional conflicts among humans? That's what he's asking the Buddha. So the Buddha's response, the first stanza addresses the need to follow the Eightfold Path. The statement is, a person established on virtue, wise, developing the mind, and wisdom. So here we find him naming the three groups of the path factors. The first he's referring to as virtue. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as ethical behavior, and it includes the three path factors of speech, action, and livelihood. And then he goes on, the second refers to developing the mind. And you'll hear that referred to as the mind training portion of the path. And it includes the three path factors of effort, mindfulness, and concentration. And then the third reference he's making is to developing wisdom. And another term for that would be insight. We practice insight meditation. And this includes the two path factors of view and intention. So the stanza continues, a practitioner ardent and discreet, she can disentangle this tangle. So being ardent or diligent, that seems pretty clear. And ardency is certainly important on this path. The second term, discreet, might seem a little less clear. It did to me until I spent some time with it. When I hear discreet, I think of being careful or almost secretive with information. But the translator who chose this term, I think, had a different meaning in mind. So some synonyms for discreet include detached, unattached, and free. So now that's making a little more sense to me. So here's what I hear in the first stanza. It states that one who follows the Noble Eightfold Path and is diligent and unattached is well positioned to disentangle the tangle. That sounds like good advice. One of the things I like to do when I'm putting the talk together is I like to see if there are any cartoons that are relevant. So this is, we'll take a break for the first Tangle related cartoon tonight. You can't see it, I know, but this is a picture of a woman who's come home with a box in her hand and she's happy and smiling. Her husband, there's a wreath on the door, it's Christmas, and he's decorating the Christmas tree. And The box she has says pre-tangled Christmas lights. She says, I've got something to save you time this Christmas. All right. Now, the second stanza of the Buddha's answer excuse me, is he's speaking to the three poisons. And those are greed, hatred, and delusion. Another set of terms for them are desire, aversion, and ignorance. So the sutta states, those for whom lust and hatred along with ignorance have been expunged. So here we have the three taints or poisons. Lust, also known as greed or desire, is the process of wanting a thing or a condition. Excuse me. And aversion or hatred is the process of wanting a thing or condition to not be. And so they're really two sides of the same coin, that of wanting. We know that the principal message of the Four Noble Truths is that wanting creates suffering, and to whatever extent we can relinquish our wanting, that's the extent to which our suffering will be reduced. Now, the third poison is referred to as ignorance. Another term is delusion. And it's the condition of not seeing clearly. So ignorance is not a pejorative term. It doesn't mean that we're dumb or we're stupid. It just means we're uninformed. It means that we don't have the information or the understanding we need. If we're unfamiliar with a town and we don't know where the drugstore is, we're not stupid. We're just ignorant of information, facts. Now, ignorance is generally understood to be the root poison of the three, and the other two, desire and aversion, arise as a result of our ignorance. It's also understood to be the hardest to eradicate because by its nature, it is concealed from the person it is affecting. So the second stanza continues, the Arhants with taints destroyed, for them the tangle is disentangled. The term Arhat is a Pali term, and it's used to refer to a fully awakened person. And that's almost always defined as somebody who has freed themselves from greed, hatred, and delusion. So what I hear in the second stanza is one who is free of greed, hatred, and delusion will naturally be free of entanglement. And just to close the circle on those three fairly negative mind states, when we begin to eliminate them, we replace them with their opposites. We replace them with generosity, loving kindness, and wisdom. So there's a guy, and he's got two nicely wrapped up cords, extension cords, I guess. He's put them on the table in front of him. And the instructions are, number one, place two cords on the table. Number two, wait 3 minutes. And the next picture, the two cords are totally entangled. And you can see the little fault bubble. He says, amazing. So the third stanza of the Buddha's response, I find to be a little more dense. I understand it to be pointing to the process by which the mind experiences any stimulus, and it's framed in the context of the teaching on the 5 aggregates. And this is a really rich, worthwhile topic, but it's beyond the scope of what we can cover tonight. So I just want to touch on it briefly. The Sutta states where name and form ceases, stops without remainder, and also impingement and the perception of form, it is here the tangle is cut. So form refers to that part of experience that arises from the 5 physical senses, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and tactile sensation. Name refers to the sixth sense, the part of experience that arises from the mental sense of thinking. And taken together, they refer to every kind of sense experience we can have. He refers to impingement, and many of you know synonyms for that would be encroachment or infringement. And it's really spoken of in the suttas as a sense object coming into contact with a sense organ and impinging on the organ or the person. So what does it mean to speak of the sensory input ceasing, stopping without remainder? I don't understand this to mean that sensory input entirely ceases. As long as we are living in this human body and our senses are intact, we've got a central nervous system and we've got all these receptors. I think they'll always continue to receive input from our environment. But what I understand this to be is a reference to the cessation of the mental reactivity to sensory input. So we're still getting the input, we're just not being reactive to it. It's really a stilling of the formations that arise as a result of feeling tone, contact, feeling tone, and perception. And there's much to be had from this last stanza, but for now I'll leave it at that. And I hope that last part makes some sense. But if not, as John Prine once said, the song will be over before you know it. So the talk will be over before you know it. So now that we've looked at each part of the sutta, let's step back and consider the analogy of a tangle. I think most people can relate to the experience of being tangled up in their own thoughts and in emotional dramas with others. There's some reason that Dear Abby had a lot of followers over all those decades. You know, we're drawn to that kind of stuff. So what's going on? Here's a quote from Philip Moffitt. What we ordinarily lump together under the label of suffering, the Buddha called a tangle, meaning a complex of physical and emotional stimuli registering in your brain and your mind's reaction to these stimuli. The Buddha taught that to penetrate suffering, you must deconstruct this tangle, but you can't construct this practice as a detached observer, as though you were a barcode scanner that reads the prices of groceries in the supermarket. On the contrary, in order for you to know its true nature, you must be with your suffering as a lived physical experience. So is it just me, or has anybody else noticed that when we meditate, our minds are inclined to wander? When we first begin to practice, the untrained mind is used to doing as it pleases, and it's not keen on being disciplined. And the undisciplined mind is a fertile ground for tangles to develop. So I'm going to offer one more quote here. This is from Jack Cornfield. He says, "It is to untangle the tangle that we begin meditation practice. To disentangle ourselves, to be free, requires that we train our attention. We must begin to see how we get caught by fear, by attachment, by aversion, and suffering." So the process by which the mind wanders is very interesting. The mind has an appetite for a constant diet of juicy, interesting stimuli. We have a new thought, and it holds our attention briefly, and then the mind quickly loses interest. So, for example, we might notice a jacket somebody's wearing, and then we might think, you know, I had a jacket like that in the 5th grade. And then we might think, oh, and my teacher in the 5th grade, I remember her. we think, oh, and then there was the kid who lived next door to her that I liked playing with. And, we just go down the rabbit hole. It's just one thing after another. And maybe the worst part is we don't see that all that's happening because we're not paying careful attention. So when we're in a quiet moment, we can begin to trace our thoughts back. And this is a skill we can learn and get better at. And we can see which thought preceded which one. And it's a little comical. I think I would recommend it to you because it's a fun thing to practice with. The connections are often random and they don't reflect any intentional mental processes. Instead, they're the result of the constant mental trolling that we do for another thought that will hold our attention for another moment. So the Buddha had a term for this mental activity, and the term is papancha, and it's often translated as mental proliferation. It is the opposite of mindfulness. So if we're practicing mindfulness and we see papancha, we need to understand that's the opposite of what we're trying to cultivate. When we are mindful in each moment, we're aware of thoughts that are arising. When thought proliferates, when we're lost in thought, we surrender mental discipline to a random appetite for stimulation. And the result is, guess what? A tangle of thoughts with no cohesive purpose. Does anybody know what that is? This is a tangle. How about this? Anybody know what that is? That's a single strand of untangled yarn. Let's tangle it with my hand. So one thing we can quickly see is that the more material we have, the easier it is for these tangles to form. If we permit our minds to run amok, indulging in random streams of thought with no underlying intention, we can expect that all the mental material is going to generate excessive tangles. So sometimes you need a lot of material. Sometimes a knitter needs to work with a lot of yarn. But if they're organized and disciplined, the tangles can be avoided. Likewise, even when we're in a busy life with many thoughts that we have coming and going rapidly, when organized and disciplined, a trained mind can prevent or reduce the tangles of papancha. So the knitter must avoid becoming a yarn slob, and the practitioner must avoid becoming a thought slob. We don't want our thoughts randomly strewn around like a house with dirty clothes on the floor, dishes in the sink, and trash overflowing from the trash can. We want to avoid becoming mind slobs. So when we train our minds through meditation, we cultivate the ability to abide mindfully. Through this, we can reduce papancha, or mental proliferation, and the tangles that go along with it. We can achieve more clarity, both within our minds and in our interpersonal relationships. And through this clarity, we move away from ignorance and toward wisdom. The end result is a life where we create less suffering for ourselves and others, and where we abide with more ease. So I'll offer that for consideration. Wait, I forgot something. So here are two octopuses, octopi, at the bottom of the ocean, and all their tentacles are totally entwined. And one's looking at the other with a scowl and saying, "This whole secret handshake thing was your idea, so you figure out how to undo it." All right, so that's the talk. And we have a little time if anybody wants to ask a question or share a thought